unfortunately, over decades, public policy has become faith illiterate. And we are showing the evidence, bringing the evidence forward frequently to government and saying, here's the evidence why faith literacy really matters. Not just the Muslim faith, all faiths.
The society that we're in, the community that we're in, that we seem to not necessarily care less, but we're less connected with our surroundings. We can see the family unit is kind of disconnected. We seem to be in silo. We just seem to be a husband, wife, and one child.
I remember Birmingham City Council, when I was an assistant director, which was an enormous job, great responsibility. We had a big conference where all the head teachers were there, and there were 3,000 people. And I turned up in my Salwar kameez. And it raised a few eyebrows. And in my later years, I've tried to encourage colleagues to be themselves, to bring their culture to work.
Make sure your children are always uncomfortable. They have lots of uncomfortable environments because they should just get used to being uncomfortable.
Many community organizations do great work, but every time they meet them, they just list a set of problems. They tell them everything that's wrong, and then they tell them how much money they want from government to fix it. Equi doesn't do that. I think the real battle is going to be the battle of ideas. Who's got the very best ideas that is going to transform belonging and transform kind of communities and their sense of belonging, and how communities work together, and how they begin to, they don't have to be in love with each other, but how they respect each other.
All right, just to introduce today's guest, what we have done in the past as well, we haven't introduced our guests just because when the show goes out, usually there's a whole list. And to be honest, if I was to, especially for yourself, and by the way, I will fluctuate between uncle and bhai with Javed uncle because I'm usually torn of.
So can I call you nephew?
Yeah, you can indeed.
Son.
Absolutely, that would make me feel awesome. To be honest, if you did that. But we'll fluctuate between uncle and bhai at some point. I would definitely won't drop at least some formality with you. But there is a long list, subhanAllah, of your achievements. I think there's a few notable ones that we'll definitely pick up on as to how you ended up there and how that kind of affected your life. For me, I think most people will know, and where I got to know you was obviously leading Barnardo's, the biggest children's charity in the country, and for a considerable period of time and with great success. I want to probably wind the clocks back a little bit. This isn't your regular podcast, so even Javed Bhai was asking me how much do you know about what I've done in the past, etc. And I think what we're trying to do in the podcast is also go back a little bit and figure out why things happen and the lessons that we can learn from that, rather than what just happened, if that makes sense. So yes, it'll be a little bit of a refresh, but also a reintroduction of our guest to a lot of you that might already know him. So the first thing that I noticed a lot in the few bits of material that I read and listened to, especially of my age, we listen more than we read now, unfortunately, was there was a lot of emphasis on the how your success was rooted back down to your family and specifically your mother. Especially now where we find the family setup is probably not the same. We would definitely argue that maybe the family isn't as strong as the unit isn't as strong as it used to be. Maybe because we've settled a bit more now. We're not the first generation immigrant families that were a lot tighter in their kind of construction. Do you think, especially in your experience, you're feeling that in your own family as a grandfather now as well?
So it's a great place to start, really, because family's always meant a great deal to me and still does, and Allah always will. And in my particular context, which is not that different from the British Kashmiri community, which I belong to. My parents came here in the late 1950s. My father had been a foot soldier in the British Indian Army for 14 years, totally illiterate, both of them, in any language. So, they were very basic kind of human beings. And the reason, perhaps you've heard me talk about my mother a lot, is because we lost our father, may Allah grant him Jannah, about 38 years ago. So, mother, really. But what they did for us, which is a bit of a cliche, they gave us a lot of love and attention and, home building and all of that. But what they couldn't give us was anything that was materialistic. There was no connection between our home and education because they couldn't speak the language. I still remember all us as siblings. translating for our parents, and whether it's a doctor's appointment or a dentist or some kind of letter or school reports, which they would never read.
You signed them off yourself,
Yeah,
I guess.
so you signed them off, right? Because you had to, otherwise you get detention. So that kind of upbringing in a place like Sparkbrook, where I grew up, which some people may know, Sparkbrook is historically one of the most deprived parts of Birmingham, and still is, actually, because it's a transient community. Every few years, people move out, and a new bunch of arrivals arrive there, and so the community, the place doesn't actually develop. It's had more regeneration money spent on it than anyone can remember, and it's probably in the same situation. So that was our existence. I went to a Church of England primary school, so it was hands together, eyes closed every morning, reading the Lord's Prayer. Jerusalem is still my favorite hymn. I had no idea what I was singing and doing, but me and the other little kids, the Muslim ones anyway, our hands would be slightly twisted, one eye might be open, it was that kind of thing, because we knew we didn't belong. Twice a year, we'd have to go to the local church and sit in a kind of ceremony of some sort, which we didn't understand. I was, would you believe, at age 11, the lead Morris dancer for our school, because I happened to be taller than the other kids. So, I don't know if you've ever seen Morris dancing, and it's an activity. Really, it has all kinds of connotations historically. But that was our upbringing. But underpinning all of that was really strong, connected, extended family, where a whole family brought up a child, our uncles and our aunties, all played a big part. Now, your point about, has that changed? Yes, of course. It's changed in many ways. And so when I look at my children and how they've grown, and we've tried our best, I've got 4 kids and 3 grandchildren now. We try our best to maintain that family unit, but I think the unit now is much smaller than it was when I, 50 years ago. The extended family was your unit. Now I think it's parents and perhaps the odd sibling, maybe a grandparent if you're lucky enough to have one, and you have to work really hard at maintaining that, because it's a 24/7 kind of culture now where everybody's doing stuff, and we're much more mobile. So, we live in different parts of the country now, if not the world. So that makes it much harder. One of my siblings, for example, my older brother, is a professor in Johannesburg, South Africa, so we don't see him very often. So naturally, it's changing. I mean, if you read the history of the world and communities, you'll see that this is a natural process, and trying to fight that process is almost impossible anyway. The advancement of education, the more money in your pocket, the opportunities that all of that gives you, I think challenges the original construct that you and I are perhaps lingering for, which in many places doesn't exist.
Do you think that's a reflection also on, like, my dad's got tons of stories for when we came into this country, and he said that in Bradford, which is obviously where I'm from, you would see people walking past, and they would be carrying their briefcase, and you'd know that they'd just arrived, and you'd say, "Oh, have you got somewhere to stay?" And if they said no, I said, "Oh, let me go and find you something." You just never left them. And I remember having this same conversation with my dad, saying, "Okay, well, we actually lived in an extended family. It was my uncle and his family and my grandparents, and we were all in one home, and it was 4 floors, and you found somewhere to sleep." And that has moved on, but also our community seems to have moved on. We seem to have, almost, it's a reflection on the society that we're in, the community that we're in, that we seem to not necessarily care less, but we're less connected with our surroundings. At that point, even my dad says when he was first in the country, somebody got him and gave him a space. And, in the old terrace houses where you have the attic has a little space between the 2 rooms. He said, just underneath there, I could crawl in and I could just find some space. That's where I slept for X amount of time. But he was happy that somebody had taken him in and shown him the ropes. Do you think there's a real reflection on, like, the actual community as well now? We can see the family unit is kind of disconnected, and it's kind of, where we seem to be in silo. We just seem to be a husband, wife, and 1 child, and we're on our own, and we don't really have that connection with our siblings, maybe with our parents, with our grandparents, definitely. That's also a reflection on the community as well, especially like in a place like Sparkbrook, where it would have been really tight, like Bradford, I guess. It
was very similar to Bradford. Probably related to half of Bradford anyway, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But I mean, this is for sociologists and people like that, and far knowledgeable than me to talk about this. How over time, what we define as culture, we define as the symbols of our cultural heritage and so on, how they change. It's not static. It always changes. My parents came from Kashmir, right? Azad Kashmir. It's changed there as well. It's unrecognizable. So it isn't just in the UK. It's a natural process that's got to happen. I'm more interested in protecting the deen as opposed to the culture, because not everything in our cultural history is actually aligned with the deen anyway. I think that's far more of a challenge for us, I think, in the 21st century, about how we, for ourselves and our children, how we remain pure and close to the deen. And if our culture kind of wobbles along the way and changes and evolves, that's a fair compromise.
Javed, you seem very confident in your identity. Like I remember, like even like when you're speaking with so much passion now about protecting faith and protecting like your heritage, especially from a faith perspective. I've seen you at a few events. You proudly wear your sherwani, your salwar kameez, your ethnic dress, etc., etc. Was it always like that? You've always been just confident from a young age, and especially with like going to Catholic school and maybe being a minority in some of those places. I think you started your life in High Wycombe, right, or something.
Yeah, I'm born in High Wycombe.
Was there a time where we saw less confident?
Yeah, virtually all of my schooling was lack of confidence. Not knowing who I was. Like a lot of kids today, I suppose, in a different way, where not understanding your own culture, your own language. I remember age 13, 14, going to shops to buy something, shoes or whatever, school uniform with my parents. And, there's something you like or you didn't like, and they'd turn to you and speak in our mother tongue, Pahari language.
Yep.
And I'd look the other way, because it's this white shopkeeper, and I'm thinking, no, that's not me. I'm English. Feeling embarrassed. And now I feel terribly embarrassed that I was like that with my parents. But that's how it was. And, is it any surprise? I remember some key moments, though, that changed this for me. In my first job, I was in South Birmingham as a maths teacher, first role in a amazing college called Cadbury College. And I remember being called to the office one day because my mother was calling me, right? Yeah. Which was a rare occasion. And I'm standing in this office, and there were like 6 or 7 white women secretaries there. And she's obviously speaking to me, to someone outside here, or, all that, right? So, and I'm feeling, my voice is getting lower and lower because I didn't want them to hear the language that I was speaking. I was terribly embarrassed by it. When I moved from that college and I went into a big further education college, it was called East Birmingham College at the time, there was a colleague of mine there who was our head of equalities. He was a big black Nigerian guy, and I say really big, kind of muscular and so on. He would come in every now and again in his Nigerian dress, one of these big colourful cloaks type of things. And I'd look at him and think, how does he do that? Where does he get the confidence from? How can he be himself? Whereas the mindset that I had was everything that's deep inside you, your DNA, your culture, your faith, and so on, is left at the gates. And you come in and you conform. You wear your cheap suit and tie and so on and try and look like everybody else. Whereas he didn't. And he was head of equalities. He was trying to make a statement. And I got to know him very well and spent quite a lot of time with him. And he became a bit of a role model for me and actually brought me out of my shell and helped me understand or begin to understand who I was, and that I shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed by that. I should bring that into my working life. And I think that was the turning point for me. So gradually I began, and then I started doing silly things like walking into lectures when I was lecturing in my shalwar kameez. Right?
The complete opposite.
Yeah, the complete opposite. I mean, it took a while. And the more senior I got, the more of it I did. Actually, because what I began to realize was it wasn't just about me. There were opportunities to influence many others who were like the younger me that needed that confidence, that needed to see somebody
You'd
else.
become the Nigerian guy.
I'd become the Nigerian, yeah. I was. I wasn't very good at it, but that's what I did. So I remember Birmingham City Council when I was an assistant director, which was an enormous job, great responsibility, 3,000 staff, 50 million budget. This is like 25 years ago. We had a big conference where all the head teachers were there, and there were like 3,000 people. And I turned up in my salwar kameez. And it raised a few eyebrows. Some people wanted to touch it, and wanted to feel the cloth and, that sort of thing. And I made my speech and I did it in my salwar kameez. And so it took a while to get to that point. And in my later years, I've tried to encourage colleagues to be themselves, to bring their culture to work, as it were.
Yeah, it feels strange now because, like, even my son in Bradford, my son's 16, they've got like some culture day today, and he's gone in his salwar kameez and he's fairly confident. It's almost the opposite. Like at Jummah, sometimes I've got my jeans and my t-shirt on, and my kids will have salwar kameez and thobes on. I'm like, it's the opposite of what you would expect. You're always expecting. Yeah, my father was always the one with salwar kameez on, and I was always the one with jeans. I've just carried on. It just seems like it skipped a generation and carried on.
You remind me of another kind of anecdote from the past in our parents' time. I don't know if your fathers ever relayed this, that those elders, they did the toughest jobs, right? They were in the dirtiest jobs. They were in the factories and the foundries and all of that, and so they were in muck, all week, except Saturday morning, right? They'd get up and they'd go and have a bath in the public baths, and they'd come out and they'd put on their one suit and tie and shirt, and they'd have some photos taken and send them back home. Right, here we are, the British boys. That's how they wanted to portray themselves. That's the country they were in.
Like my dad's got plenty of those photographs, and I always say, like, my dad worked in a bulb factory for most of his life, 16 years. He's a mechanic now, still practicing. He's 66, but he always used to have, like, Saturday morning was just a day where you dress up, you washed up, you had your suit on, you had your flares. There's those black and white pictures of him in his flares, and he's walking around. And I was like, when did you make the time for that? It was always like he had, like, typical story that everybody has, right? Like 3 jobs. Working late nights, working weekends, evenings, day, whatever time you could, but you still found time to say, okay, I've got some me time, and that's when you would you'd brush up, I guess. I think my first, skipping forward and back, so I hope you don't get lost in all of it. We got acquainted, I guess, over Equi. So Equi is a think tank. I want to give you an opportunity to probably tell us more about what you're trying to do there. And it was my first introduction, and I remember just reading a little bit about you or just watching some stuff, and all I could read was, I think it was a show or a text where you were saying, well, I'm kind of semi-retired. Yeah, I remember something along those lines where I'm semi-retired, I've got a grandchild now, I want to spend more time at home. It was almost like I've done my bit. Yeah, I've served as this, I've served as this, I've said this, and there's no more. What brings you back into the spotlight? What brings you back into, okay, I'm going to be building another organization? And you've gone from, obviously, Bernardo's with probably hundreds of staff to starting essentially a startup. I know we had some discussion about being in a startup, but essentially being a startup at the tender age of whatever this
62 now.
Yeah, 62.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're spot on. I stopped working after 38 years of full-time work when I left Bernardo's. With the absolute clear plan that this was retirement for me. I wanted to stop doing the 24/7. I was 70, 80 hours a week whilst I still could do other things and be the dutiful son and the husband and the father and the grandfather. So that was clearly the plan. Didn't quite work out that way because very quickly I got asked to do other things.
Yep.
My one rule was that I wouldn't work full time for anybody. But I started doing some non-executive director stuff and helping the government with the odd little review on important matters and so on. But that was all fine and going very smoothly to the point where I started playing cricket again. I now play county cricket in the over-60s team, which is a great achievement for me with my dodgy knees. And then last year, something very special happened. And I take no responsibility for it. A number of people came to me and said, look, there's a gap in all the institutions that exist at the moment, and the idea was that we needed a new think tank, one that was driven by British Muslim insight to influence government policy on behalf of all British citizens, because what's good for Muslims is good for everybody. That's the kind of mantra or the logic, if you like, and that they wanted me to run it. And I thought, yeah, it's a great idea, do the organization, but I'm not your man, right? I'm yesterday's person. You need somebody who's still got an ego that needs massaging, somebody who still wants profile and wants to do podcasts and all this stuff, right? That's all behind me. I'm happy to advise. But of course, these people who I had a lot of respect for didn't take no for an answer and persuaded me to come out of retirement. I said I'd do it part-time and I'd get it to a point where it's established, has credibility, is delivering, and then we'll develop a succession plan. So that's what I press-ganged into. It's now a year on, and Equi is, as I say, a year old. And, by the grace of the Almighty, only the mistakes are ours, but the success has been enormous. Much, much better than anybody expected. We're established, we have credibility, we're producing outcomes that are being celebrated far and wide. We have political traction in an environment that is very difficult to have traction in. particularly when you're speaking as a Muslim, and a proud Muslim in an organization that clearly says we are here to capture British Muslim insight, but for the benefit of everyone. That's not an easy sell, if you like. But as I say, it's gone very well. The doors seem to be wide open to have influence. But this is in the context of a world that is quite a dangerous place at the moment, I think. I would say that we've all got to work together. And when I say all, I don't mean just a particular community. I think everybody, 68 million people in this country, have got to work really closely together and find that which binds us and overcome what divides us. Right? That's what our children's children will want us to do, to develop a way of being in this country where we can celebrate divisions if they exist, and we don't get driven into division by those differences, whether it's faith-related or culture or whether it's identity or what. There are many forces out there that would want us to stop that kind of conversation between communities. And I think Equi is one cog in a wheel. It's not going to solve everything itself. It will play its part in trying to bring those conversations to the table. So that's what we're about. This is a journey of community cohesion. This is about trying to give sense where sense has been lost in some ways. It's about developing evidence, hard research, translating it into public policy that is good for Greater Britain, whether it's economic prosperity, whether it's improving the services that we all rely upon, education, housing, health, whether it's tackling criminal injustices in this country, whether it's supporting the victims, whether it's interfaith dialogue. All of those things, right? They all matter to Equi. We only talk about issues in the UK, not international. So, it's what matters on the doorsteps of Britain, which I believe, and we were talking about our youngsters earlier, what are they going through? That's what they want to see. Their connection with the ancestral homeland, which is 3 or 4 generations away from their existence, is getting weaker and weaker, whether we like it or not. They need to see impact and improvement on the streets that they walk on. And that's what I think Equi is trying to do.
Yeah, I think there's been a massive shift. I think probably around sort of COVID time, where I think more people started associating Britain as home. Like before that, you still say, well, back home. But I think what COVID did do was bring us all together. Like especially, in Bradford, for example, the number of people that came together, organisations, individuals, committees, etc., just to look at who are the most needy in the community, and we started to have an agenda about who needs something from the people of Bradford. And it was just an effort. I just felt there was a shift around that sort of time where people started to say, well, actually, this is home because this is where we're at. We're not fleeing this country to go back to Pakistan or India or Bangladesh right now. We're actually trying to figure out how we can help the people here. One of the interesting things on the Equi website is the publications that you've managed to do so far. One thing that you can clearly notice is a lot of it is about celebrating the success of British Muslims. So there's stuff around arts and cultural sort of contributions to the UK community. There's also stuff around the business. How important is it at the early stages for you to be able to explore? Because at the moment, the agenda isn't as wide as probably what you're discussing. The agenda so far has been, okay, let's just look at and discover what Muslims have contributed to British society, just to bring that to the forefront. How important is that for you in the early days, just to...
It's very important, but I would just caveat it with that celebration sometimes sounds like, it's just like you're shining a light on something, and that in itself is the outcome. It's more than that. This is about hard evidence. The research has to be very high quality, and it's about trying to get underneath the surface of what communities are doing day in, day out. Whether it's what the local mosque is doing, or the local community hub, or the food bank, or the youth club, or something like that. These organizations exist within our communities. They don't necessarily fully understand the impact that they are having, the multiplier effect of their daily activities. What Equi is trying to do is shine a light on that and back it up with detailed evidence and research. So just a couple of weeks ago, we launched our latest report, which is about Muslim-led organizations that are helping tackle youth violence. Youth violence is a big issue in this country. In the last year, we've seen a 141% spike in teenage homicides across the UK. Right? It's a crisis. This city that we're sitting in at the moment, London, is at the forefront of that challenge. We identified 7 Muslim-led community organizations, and we studied them in detail to understand what they are doing. And we unraveled impact that they themselves hadn't identified. They were doing good work. Cut a long story short, we showed that they were reaching 45,000 people every year across those 7 organizations. They were saving the state the equivalent of £30 million with the investment of time, effort, and impact that they were having. They were running through mosques, they were running through food banks, they were running through community centers. They were providing the support services for challenged, vulnerable communities and young people that the state isn't able to do because of austerity and a whole range of other issues. And they were having impact. Ultimately, they were diverting young people from entering into a world of crime or stopping the reoffending of young people who had already been there through a whole range of really creative ways. Now, that isn't just important for Muslims. What we're highlighting in that report is that, and through those case studies, is there are examples of what when social capital is harnessed in a community, untapped social capital, the difference it can make to solve the problems of the day. These organizations were doing it through a faith lens. That works for some, it doesn't work for everybody, and we don't pretend that it works for everybody. But what we're asking government to do is take note of this. Why wouldn't you? This is delivering some of the agendas that you are grappling with day in, day out and can't find a solution to. And we're also saying that don't ignore faith. Faith literacy really matters in public policy. Unfortunately, over decades, public policy has become faith illiterate. And we are showing the evidence, bringing the evidence forward frequently to government and saying, here's the evidence why faith literacy really matters. Not just the Muslim faith, all faiths. But from our perspective, we're bringing this evidence from the Muslim community.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to pause just here just to see if there's any questions, any insights, anything that anybody wants to share. I was told you were going to have some tough questions, bro, but it seems like everything is above board for you.
To what extent do you think then that communities and faith-based communities specifically are, trying to fill that gap? Is this a gap that they should be filling in the first place? Right, that's the bigger question. But also that what does the future of these, gaps and filling up these gaps look like in the next 5 to 10 years? And I was just wondering from your perspective whether you have any thoughts on that.
So there are a number of angles in which to answer that question. I mean, firstly, we've got to recognize the journey that this country's gone through to get to where it is now. Context matters. And so, for at least 15 years, we've had serious austerity applied to public service finances. I mean, I used to be a director in local government, so I understand what it used to be like in the noughties and then what happened in the 2010s and onwards. So that has had a dramatic effect on the way public services have been delivered, their ability to reach the most vulnerable, and the quality of service that they're able to provide. So, we all use doctor surgeries. We all try to get a dentist appointment if we can. We all use A&E in hospitals, and you know how long and how that feels when you're doing it. But then when you get even to the more vulnerable people, those who have serious disabilities or young teenagers with mental health trying to get that first kind of appointment. And, if you exhibit social anxiety, and 1 in 4 young girls at age 14 are exhibiting social anxiety in their schools at the moment, and the vast majority of them are going undiagnosed. And even when they're diagnosed, it can take about 18 months before your first appointment, where you get, somebody tries to understand what your challenge is like. Imagine what they're going through in that 18 months of how it gets worse and worse and worse. The system kicks in when you get at the highest end of need. That's when it kicks in. But then we be prioritizing the early intervention, get there earlier. So that's the context that we're in. So your question about, should the communities be stepping up and doing this? I don't think it's a question of should. I think, what is the potential? The question I would ask. And I'm a great believer in we need to, as a society, our government needs to do everything it can to reach the untapped social capital that exists in all of our communities, bar none. The untapped value of that is enormous. And if Equi is making any contribution, it's shining a light and highlighting some of that untapped potential from a faith angle and saying, look, you're not aware of this. This is the difference it's making. It is improving young people's mental health. It is reducing the impact of loneliness, which is a major epidemic in this country, which people often don't even recognize. When you look at children in care, what community organizations are doing to reduce the number of children going into care or improve the outcomes for those already in care. These are all big issues that government is grappling with all the time. We want them to understand the value that communities bring to that table. And that doesn't mean the communities can solve it all. So it doesn't absolve the government responsibility. It means the communities need to be part of the solution, the overall solution. That notion of a cog in the wheel, where you've got to recognize that the cog is there, support it, enable it, develop public policy that allows it to flourish rather than suffocate.
Anybody else? Yes.
Can I ask, or can you talk to us more about what the reception of those reports has been in government, and if you have any words on how policymakers can use insight from those reports and feed them down the policymaking pipeline and channels, and how we can use that at a government level to have an impact on policy?
So again, context matters. So we're in an environment at the moment, for whatever reason, where if you talk about the British Muslim community and it's the negativity associated with that, you'll get all kinds of traction. All the media outlets will cover it in a blink. And you can pick up any newspaper, any radio, any kind of online, and you'll get lots of those stories. However, if you're trying to turn that around and write a new narrative and say, actually, look at the positives from this community, that's much harder to get coverage for, because at the moment, I'm not saying it's right, that's how it is at the moment. So our efforts at trying to get media coverage, for example, media matters, it matters to politicians as well, it begins to influence public opinion, has been hard, very, very hard, because people just aren't used to these positive stories. You bring out crime stats and how many Muslims are involved, or poor housing and how many Muslims have poor housing, or poor health, everybody will cover it. We're not doing that at Equi because we don't need to. It's already done. We're not duplicating all of that research. Everybody knows this. They don't really, whether they do anything about it is another matter, but they already know it. So we're doing the opposite, and that's difficult. However, it's worth bearing in mind, if you look at any of our reports, all of our public policy recommendations are directed at government. Our conclusions all speak to government. They don't speak to communities. We're not telling our respected imams what to say at a Friday khutbah. We're telling the Secretary of State for Health, or Education, or Culture, Media and Sport, or Work and Pensions, or Justice. We're telling them, a number 10 policy unit. We're advising them on what they need to do to try and reflect the opportunities that our research is bringing forward to them. So you know how, and a minister told me this recently, many community organizations do great work, but every time they meet them, they just list a set of problems. They tell them everything that's wrong, and then they tell them how much money they want from government to fix it. Equi doesn't do that, and the minister appreciated this. She said that this was one of a breath of fresh air, that here's an organization that actually isn't coming to us with problems. It's coming to us with solutions. The long list of this is what you can do to fix it. And you're not asking us for any money. We're not. We don't want any government money. We want that independence. We want to be able to speak truth to power. We want Muslim philanthropists to fund this if they believe in what we're doing. And if they don't, we'll just stop. Somebody else can do it. But so that's an advantage that we bring. And therefore, I believe that the traction we're having with ministers and MPs, and most importantly, the civil servants, who are the policy developers behind the scenes, is because of those key ingredients in the way that we are presenting it. Highly sophisticated, highly articulate, proper research and evidence that is credible and is solutions focused, and not asking for money, right? But advising them on what they need to do. Those ingredients seem to be landing well at the moment.
Just following on from some other questions, have you seen any early signs of success in whatever shape or form that is at the moment? You're saying we're going and we're speaking and people are saying positive things. Is there anything more that you can share?
So we talk about this all the time at Equi with our board as well, about how you measure impact. Right? Yeah. That's the big kind of debate. And I've dealt with this in my chief executive years as well. Even at Bernardo's, we always talked about, well, are we really having impact? We had 20,000 people working with 300,000 vulnerable children. How do you measure impact? How do you know you're actually any good at what you do? And so the debate is an unending one. At Bernardo's was slightly different because he was 150 plus years old. We had a lot of experience. Here we've got 1 year's experience, right? So our approach to this is to say that the impact we're looking for is to impact public policy. So the policy changes, embraces, and kind of benefits from what we are saying. That doesn't happen overnight. Anybody who's got anywhere close to influencing public policy at government level knows that doesn't happen quickly. It's a slow burner, it's a marathon, not a 100-meter dash. So in that context of knowing you can't fix things quickly, because even when you think you're fixing it, some wind will blow and then, the agenda changes and, you're back at square one again. So you've got to have proxy indicators of success, of impact. And the proxy indicators are, for example, the media hits that you get. Each new report we publish, are we getting more media traction? Are we getting more mainstream media traction, the BBC and LBC Radio, et cetera, et cetera? And one of our, the report I was referring to on tackling serious youth violence, yesterday we had 4 interviews with BBC as a result of that, right? That's more than we've ever had before. So there's an indicator. Then the other indicators are connections with civil servants who are developing policy behind the scenes. What kind of response do we get from them when we send them the report and we try to engage them? Are they willing to have roundtables with us to discuss the detail of the findings? And then are we getting meetings with politicians themselves? Are they not just listening to us, but are they willing to come to us? Are they willing to speak on our platforms, in front of the Equi banner, etc.? So a great indicator was just 3 weeks ago at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. We decided to be quite brave and bold. We're only 1 year in. 1 year is nothing in this world of think tanks. And we thought we'd be bold, and we held the Equi reception. Not a reception, but the Equi reception. 1 year on was how we build it. And thinking, we might get 20, 30 people turning up. We might get the odd member of parliament there and so on. Cut a long story short, we had over 150 guests. We had the Home Secretary, and we had Wes Streeting, the Secretary for Health and Social Care, along with a number of other MPs and so on. So anybody who's done fringe meetings at party conference, and I used to do these for over a decade with Bernardo's and victim support before that, if you get one minister at a fringe meeting on a panel, you've done really well. If you get a cabinet secretary, it is great success. But to get 2 cabinet secretaries is virtually unprecedented. It just doesn't happen. And to happen for it to happen for an organization that's 1 year old, we were flabbergasted. There is a proxy indicator of success, of where we are being regarded as credible, that the people in power who make the decisions want to be aligned with us, want to hear what we've got to say. It's not the change of policy, not yet, in any particular way, but these are the stepping stones you need to go through.
So how do you reconcile, obviously, recently what we're seeing in the news, and there's this kind of whole rhetoric around the far right and how quickly it's picking up pace, and the conversations that are happening in this country that probably didn't happen a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And then I was reading upon your kind of journey for the recommendations that you made to the government about removing tobacco from this country, for example. And you, in your own words, said that it took, not one government, but a change of leadership, and then it got shelved again, and then it came back again, and eventually it's making itself, well, we've got a promise at the moment that it's going to be introduced, right? It seems like such a long process. And part of the country, I think, is almost hopeful for the leaders in the community, especially, say, all right, what we're doing, yes, we've got the slow burner stuff, and 100%. I don't think anybody's expecting Equi to change the world overnight or to bring solutions. But what are leaders expected to do in this time where, especially when you've got fundamental responsibilities almost that we've got to, well, we've got a problem on our hands, we've got to be dealing with this, and at the same time we've got to have the slow burning stuff. How do you reconcile some of that stuff? Like, are those the priorities you should be working on, or are they not the priorities that we should be working on?
Gosh, if I knew the complete answer to that, I'd probably be running the world in some way.
It was the same question, to be honest.
It's a tough one.
I asked Shabir by this morning, and I said, well, we've got the British Muslim Trust, and we're looking at collecting data around Islamophobia in this country. And that's a process. A little bit like Equi, it's a slow burning process, and it will take probably years before we can get to a stage where the community feels really, really comfortable about sharing their data with an organization and reporting every single incident of hate crime, so that we can have real records of exactly what happened. A lot of the questions that were being asked of him were, well, actually, what we're doing today, tomorrow, this week, this month, next year, like, there's some real issues on our doorsteps. Are we doing anything as a community to do with them? Because everything that we're hearing at the moment seems like it might be slow burning, and it will take time. And obviously, nobody's doubting that we should be doing it. But there's a chance that maybe it will be, I'm not saying little too late, but that's what the thoughts are going in my head. It's like, maybe 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. Is there anything doubt in your head? I think
No, there's no doubt at all. And I think that's really important for anybody who's trying to lead a journey like this.
Yeah.
It's not, doubts aren't part of it. But you've got to be very realistic. The old saying of Rome wasn't built in a day.
Yep.
Right. And I remember reading a book once when I was in my chief executive days, and the opening chapter starts with when Michelangelo, the great artist, was asked how he produced something as beautiful as David sculpture.
Yep.
He said it was easy. I took a block of clay and I chipped off everything that didn't look like him. It's worth reflecting on, right? That leadership is like that. I think you've got to, you've got to have a clear vision of what you're trying to create here, where the journey you're trying to travel on, and hold on to that and make sure it's aligned with your values. Make sure your intentions are really good and pure along the way, and don't let anything compromise that. But beyond that, there are going to be hurdles. There are going to be lots of kind of challenges, and things are going to go slow, and then it'll be fast, and then it'll be slow again. And governments change. Ministers come and go. We had a very good relationship with the Deputy Prime Minister, who's now gone. There's a new Deputy Prime Minister. You've got to start all over again. These are the things you can't predict, but you've got to stick to your path of why you're doing it and the ultimate difference you want to make. And ultimate difference for Equi, I say again, is to have a economically cohesive, prosperous UK for everyone. And we play our part in that. This isn't just about what's right for British Muslims. And I think if we hold on to that kind of message and that kind of mission, we're going to win people over as we go along, because everybody wants to be part of that. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they, right? So you've got to be resilient on this journey. And some things will take time. And your point about, you've cleverly put in at the end about, will it be too late for some? Unfortunately, it will, right? We're talking about changing something which is very significant at a very significant level. We're not talking about fixing something on a street or within a ward or a constituency. This is a government level, right? It's countries that drive cultural change. We want to be part of that journey. We want to present the solutions. That takes time. And some things will happen quickly and some won't. And unfortunately, other stuff will, in the meantime, fall by the wayside. I think the real challenge, if you put me on the spot about what Equi is really about over the long term, I genuinely believe that the next 15, 20 years in this country, probably other countries as well, challenge isn't about, short fixes here and and bigger fixes there, and tinkering here and tinkering there, and maybe even battles, political battles otherwise. I think the real battle is going to be the battle of ideas. Who's got the very best ideas that is going to transform belonging and transform kind of communities and their sense of belonging, and how communities work together, and how they begin to, they don't have to be in love with each other, but how they respect each other and they welcome each other. There's going to be a battle of ideas. Who's got the best ideas? At the moment, some of the ideas are quite negative, and you see the influence they are having on society, and individuals are feeling it. We want to be at the forefront of that, along with a number of other people who've got their part to play. That's where we need to be. That isn't about money, not about resources. How do we invest in our idea development? And if we can get that right, that in the long run is going to transform stuff. And you gave the example of the smoking review. I was under a lot of pressure not to do anything important.
That also came at a time where you were retired.
I was retired, yes. Yeah. So June 22 is when I published my report.
Yeah.
And in my usual Kashmiri style, it was bold, it was brave. It said something that people didn't expect it to say. That, let's not tinker with policy and fix this little bit here and a little bit there and raise the age of smoking from 18 to 19 or something like that. And said, if we're really serious, let's make this a smoke-free country. That's what the country actually needs. That's what future generations are going to need. And everybody said, that's never going to happen. 27th of October, in 2 weeks' time, the House of Lords is having its final reading of that policy. It's gone through Parliament now. It's gone through House of Commons. And it'll come back from the House of Lords. I think it's not going to be changed much. And in the new year, it'll be legislation. It'll be the most significant public health intervention in this country in a generation. Now, these things don't come easy. And that's taken 3 years, 3.5 years now. Imagine
which in the grand scheme of things is not a long time.
In the scheme of government, it's not a long time at all. However, if you're walking down the street, you see a problem, you want it fixed today.
Yeah, of course. And I guess this is the kind of community that we live in. I think we're looking for solutions almost immediately for everything that's happening around us. And even Equi was born out of frustration that we don't have our we don't have our ducks in order. We just seem to be scattered to a certain degree, and we're doing bits here and we're doing bits there. I want to just reverse a little bit and just go back before Equi. We've talked a lot about Equi. I think you've done really well giving us a plug there. There's, especially with, I've always read about the Prophet ﷺ, where he talked about his community, and he meant, when he said community, he meant the Muslims, the non-Muslims, those that worshipped one God, those that worshipped many gods, those that didn't worship God, but everybody within the vicinity. So when he spoke to the people of Mecca and he said, my community, he meant everybody within it. So it doesn't matter who you were part of his community, and your problems were his problems. I see, your kind of intervention in lots of places, almost being from, like, I can see them being very faith driven, but at the same time still apply to a wider community. So your work with Bernardo's, for example, looking after children. Professor Sana was a humongous advocate for looking after children. Your work now with removing, smoking from this country, how many lives it will save, how many people it will affect. How do we get, and the purpose of the question is, how do we get more people thinking about, when they look around sort of Islamic leadership, they're not just looking inwardly and thinking, okay, what do I do for my local mosque? What do I do for my local, prayer facility, for my local Muslim community, whatever they're thinking? How do we get people to think more about the wider community in a way that maybe you have done? Maybe it's not through your choice, but just the route that God decided to take you. But how do we get more people to start thinking, well, okay, this is the entire community that I should be focused on. As a Muslim leader, my responsibility is not necessarily just those that come to the mosque to pray, but those that live next door and the ones that live behind it, those that live around it.
Firstly, all the things I've done, been hugely, hugely blessed. The opportunities, I take no credit for that. It's from the Almighty. But there are some principles within that journey that are important. So when I was a front-line teacher teaching fractions to people who hated fractions, right? I regarded that as a form of sadaqah. Because that's what I think teaching is. Right? You are imparting knowledge to those who need it. And you won't know how they're going to use that knowledge in years to come. You're planting a seed, right? And it will grow into an oak tree, it'll grow into something else. And so the principle of giving has always been part of that. And I think teaching is fundamentally sadaqah. And that's why my heart still goes out to anybody. And I know we've got some teachers in the audience today. They are the salt of the earth because they are imparting knowledge. Now, that stayed with me in everything I've done. Every twist and turn in my career, it's always been about working with vulnerable people, working with the needy, whether they're young or they're old, or the victims of crime, or the vulnerable children and Bernardo's. So that's something that stayed with me. I think that's a principle we should be encouraging in all our communities, whether it's from the Imam's khutbah, and what the Imams say in the modern day Britain. I would say possibly controversial. I think they should be talking about today's issues rather than the set speeches from 1400 years ago. Right? The relevance is there, and they should make the connection, and they should recite the hadith and so on and explain it to us. But they should be in the context of today's challenges. So even more controversial, people talking about the big issues around the country of child sexual exploitation, and how some members of the so-called Muslim community, although nothing they've done is connected with Islam, of course, have been guilty of that. I think we should be talking about these issues in our Friday sermons. We should be educating our community about our responsibilities to each other, to the vulnerable. The father who knows that the son is doing something wrong, the father has a responsibility to intervene, not simply wait for the money or the BMW that's going to come, or have the windows double glazed from money from ill-gotten means, or build the koti back in Mirpur. Right? These things need to be discussed and talked about with due sensitivity. And I think if we begin to have that kind of boldness, and I know saying it is easier than doing it, probably the imams are ready for it, but the mosque committees may not be. Right? And there are challenges there. Who are the mosque committees? It's people like us. So I think there's a core challenge of how we transform our community to take responsibility for ourselves and our contribution to everybody else, and how we look after our neighbors. You gave the example earlier about COVID. Beautiful, beautiful time that was, as painful as it was.
Yep.
Because we saw the very best of community spirit come out onto the streets. You remember not just the, looking after your neighbor and shopping for them if you can, the elderly, coming out every Thursday night and banging the pots and pans and all of that, celebrating what the NHS is doing. Volunteering numbers shot up. Volunteering in Islam, highly recommended.
Yep.
Look after your community, look after your environment, whether it's the parks and the walkways or the elderly or your neighbors, the rights of your neighbors. These are all principles of faith. And all of that was rediscovered during COVID. We should find ways of encouraging and continuing. I was talking to our local mosque, something that they're doing recently about food banks stuff. So they've continued it. They started it in COVID and realized the need is still there. Wonderful, and there's no limitation on who can come and take the food. In fact, the bulk of the people who come and take it are not Muslims. Wonderful, that's our contribution. Let's do more of that. But let's have the brave and bold conversations as well.
At the same time. Yeah, absolutely. Just some quick fire questions to start wrapping up. 3 qualities that you think a leader in 2025 needs to have if they're going to be representing the Muslim community or representing the community at large.
Authenticity, got to be right at the, because if you're not authentic, you get found out. So you should. And if you're not authentic, don't do it. Somebody else do it. I think really good intentions are very important, because that is what will keep you grounded to your deen and your purpose and the vision that you started off. And then absolute resilience, because be ready for the knocks. They're going to come.
Brilliant. And if you were giving advice to parents, because I know you're a granddad now, I'm going to keep reminding you of that, just in case
Very
you
happy
forgot.
to be
Alhamdulillah. If you're, for people that are raising children, I asked this question to Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. I asked him the question. I said, if you were, advice to parents that are bringing up children, what qualities should children have, and what qualities should parents focus on building in their children? Any advice for maybe your children when you're trying to bring up grandchildren?
It's a really good question, and I often think back to my childhood, right? So I went to a Church of England school, Lord's Prayer every morning, all that kind of stuff, right? My parents knew nothing about it.
Yeah.
There was no connection, and so they never told us not to. We never had that kind of, and what harm did it do me? Possibly a lot of harm, but what harm did it do me? If that was today, and somebody like, our children going to that kind of school, and we'd intervene, right? We want to stop this, and we stop that. Or some community that, it gets very vociferous. And they say, don't do that, right? What is the right thing? What's the right balance? I often think about this, and I'm not sure I've got the answer. What is the right kind of level of involvement in, interfaith work for young minds? Because we live in fear, don't we? We think, oh, well, if they go to the church, they're going to be influenced heavily and move away from the deen. I'm not sure that is the case, actually. Having some sense of worship and understanding of the Almighty, that there is a greater presence that controls your destiny. Not in your control, you've got to be good, honest, fair, compassionate, and so on. These are principles that all major faiths teach. So my answer in a roundabout sort of way is, I think sometimes some parents get too fixated with the kind of parrot fashion type of, drill it into them, send them to the mosque and your job is done, and if you don't need to do anything at home. We have some very learned, knowledgeable young people who are sitting in our prisons at the moment. The knowledge and that practice that was drilled into them didn't stop them from doing what they did. We've got questions to ask, I think. It isn't a precise answer because I haven't got one, because I don't think there is a parent out there who's got it right, including me.
Yeah, 100%. I think I'll tell you what Ibrahim Rasool said. It was along the lines of, make sure your children are always uncomfortable. They have lots of uncomfortable environments because they should just get used to being uncomfortable. I remember I interviewed somebody for a role. This was just after October 7th, 2 years ago, and it was for a marketing job. I remember that I spoke to this candidate over Zoom or whatever. He was only local to us. He was like, 10 miles away or something. Offered him, a match salary and all the rest of it, but he got to work for Muslim organizations. He would get to work on a project for Gaza. He would get to work on things like Equi and all this sort of stuff. And I remember his response at the end of it, which just annoyed me, and I don't get annoyed that easy. he just said, "Oh, I'm just comfortable at the moment." I thought, with everything going on, and the amazing thing was we had a conversation for about 20 minutes about everything that was going on in Gaza and how we could do what we could do to stop it and how we could change things and all the rest of it. And he was like, I'm completely shattered and broken. I wish I could do something. And then when the opportunity came, his comfort was more important than. I hope he's not watching. His comfort was more important than the fact that he could actually do something. So I found that remarkable that he'd actually said, "Well,
I'm not
actually,
surprised by that at all.
yeah," because his whole life was almost like
That's right.
it was uncomfortable situation after.
But I
uncomfortable
think
situation.
it's that isn't just young people today. I think there is a understanding the psyche of human beings and how we think and work and so on. When I've met lots of people over the years who will say, or will ask me, how did you break the glass ceiling? How did you get into the higher echelons and so on? And you listen to their career story, and one thing that always stands out is their lack of ability to take a risk and step out of comfortability into the uncomfortable. And that's what. And it's not just the Asians or Muslims, or it's all of society. I would say. You look at most people, they tend to prefer comfortability. They tend to prefer what they know. They've established themselves 4 or 5 years in an organization. It's time to move.
Yep.
They'll apply internally and won't get the job because the employers prefer somebody coming in from outside. They won't move, and then 20 years later, they are the victim as far as they're concerned. I've been done to, I didn't get the rewards I wanted and so on. Trace back and say, well, what could you have done different? Well, I didn't want to move because I've got all my friends here,
Stable job, stable income.
It's the
stable
risk that they don't want to
something.
take. So comfortability, I'm not surprised that young person said that to you, because when push comes to shove, very few people are like me in that sense, because I was always a risk taker. It's a key ingredient. I changed professions 7 times in my 38 years. Literally changed professions, from being a teacher to being a local government officer to being a civil servant to being chief executive of voluntary sector to Equi. And I missed a few out there in the middle. Each one of those was really painful. Not easy, your network changes, you've got to learn a new job in a new environment, the internal politics changes. Why would people want to do that? Most don't, and therefore they limit them. They move along.
So I think you'd agree that if you're going to build equality in the kids, maybe ability to take risks, ability to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Those sort of things.
Of course, we're all guilty, aren't we? Because the things we didn't have was when we were kids, we try and provide them for our kids. Right?
I think this is just like it's an immigration thing. I think
it's a middle class perspective.
Yeah, when my dad came here, I think like his fundamental thing was that my kids need to be comfortable, and then we got comfortable, and said, well, actually, there's a lot more to life. We need to do X, Y, and Z. And our children now, like my kids, are definitely not comfortable. I get told off for making life hell for both my 20-year-old and 16-year-old. But that just seems like it's gone full circle. Like we came to this country almost looking for comfort. And we found, well, actually, to survive here or to build here, not just to survive, to thrive here, we need to be uncomfortable as people.
My kids will never forgive me for never buying them a PlayStation. Right? They used to ask for it, and we said, no, I haven't one. They said, we know you can afford it. Why don't you buy us a PlayStation?
Oh, Ustad, we sound like two old men now. We've gone from like learning to just ranting about, back in the days. I never had a PlayStation either. My dad never bought me. I remember asking my dad for a computer, and he bought me an Amstrad 464.
Right.
And it was like, this is not a Nintendo. He was happy because he had a keyboard and he had a monitor, so it felt like I was doing some work.
You had a computer? Wow.
I am like 20 years younger, so alhamdulillah. All right, with that, I think it's been a pleasure speaking to you and learning more about you. I think what this opportunity gives me when we're doing the podcast is actually to start learning a little bit more about the people that I've become familiar with, but really don't know much about. So alhamdulillah, it's been awesome having you. Thank you for our guests, for those that joined us a bit later, but alhamdulillah you're here. I want to open up the floor just one last time. If anybody's got any last questions, any remarks, any thank yous, anything to say, I guess. Raheem, have you got anything?
Stunned into silence.
Alhamdulillah. Oh, we were expecting you to have a question. Here we are. Yes.
Yeah. the way the reports are written at the moment, probably not a lot, actually. And we make no apology for that. Because one of the things we were very clear about when we set up Equi is that we didn't want to duplicate what others are already doing. And there are a lot of organizations out there that are writing reports directed at communities. And we didn't want to do that because why would we do what people are already doing? It was the gap that we identified, that it was speaking to government is what was missing. All those other organizations are producing really interesting stuff, but it doesn't go anywhere. We didn't want to duplicate that. So at the moment, we're not speaking to community. That's not to say we don't respect the community, because our evidence all comes from the community. All the insight comes from the community. But it's written for a specific purpose.
Attending.